My name is Russell Colts. I'm a psychology professor at Eastern Washington University and a clinical psychologist. And so much of my work is teaching and doing research and doing psychotherapy with clients and training people to become master's level psychotherapists. At EWU we have a master's program there. And several years ago I became involved in something called compassion-focused therapy. And compassion-focused therapy actually is a model of therapy that draws upon things like evolutionary psychology and the neuroscience of emotion, right? How emotions play out in the brain, and attachment theory, how we form and maintain relationships, and through relationships, particularly early ones, learn ways of relating to ourselves and to others. But at the level of practice and technique, compassion-focused therapy, or CFT as we call it, also draws actually quite heavily from Buddhist practices. And it's not that we sort of purposefully said, well, let's rip off the Buddhists, let's reach in. But as you probably have discovered over the last 2,500 years, Buddhism and Buddhist practitioners and Buddhist teachers have developed very sophisticated ways of working with the mind. And one of the really exciting things that's happened in the last 20, 30 years in psychology, and particularly has heated up quite a lot in the last 10, 15, is that people in psychological science have taken note of that and said, well, gosh, we've got all this wisdom here. How can we kind of look at this through the lens of science and see kind of how this works and how we can apply it? And so increasingly, we've got scientific studies that are validating and supporting what Buddhists have been teaching for thousands of years. And there's been some very sophisticated studies, even like imaging, brain imaging studies, that have shown that the sort of mind training that monks and nuns go through can produce really powerful changes even in the way the brain works. So, for example, there was a study not too long ago. Actually, it was a number of years ago. I believe it was Richie Davidson's group at the University of Wisconsin. And they were looking at what happens in people's brains when they hear distress cries. I think I'm getting this right. I've read lots of studies. And for most of us, when we hear a distress cry, you see this pattern of activation in the brain that's associated with a threat response and stress and sort of wanting to move away. So there's an asymmetry between the left and right hemisphere that kind of favors the right. And what they found is when you looked at these Buddhist monks who had like well over 10,000 hours of meditation training, you saw a very different pattern of activation. They heard the distress cry, but they had more activation actually. I think it was in the left hemisphere of the brain. And the pattern of activation actually that the monks showed wasn't what you would see in people who were freaking out and trying to get away. It was more of an approach sort of activation, like wanting to go toward and to help. And that's a pretty amazing thing, because that's not something you can decide. Right? You can't just decide. These are implicit responses. We don't get to decide, well, I think I'd rather activate this side of my brain versus that today. Right? But the idea, increasingly we're learning that working with the mind can change the brain. And that's a pretty amazing thing. And so I guess that's kind of a long way of saying that finally, I think psychology has embraced a good bit of the wisdom that Buddhism has been teaching for thousands of years. And of course, because psychology is a science, we have to subject really everything we do and talk about to scientific scrutiny. And what we're seeing is that these mind training practices are holding up under that scrutiny, and actually the research is really supporting them as really powerful ways of working with suffering and working with our minds, which is pretty cool. So actually I found my way to compassion-focused therapy through Buddhist practice. I started out with Buddhist practice. I didn't start out with CFT. What had happened is that, to kind of keep it the shorter version of it, a number of years ago when my son was born, I became aware that I wasn't quite the parent I wanted to be. You know, I was someone who was kind of born with an irritable temperament. Right, I'm not one of these like really easygoing people. I wish I was. You probably know people like this. But folks are just like, you know, oh yeah, you know, you take it, you know, easygoing, take things in stride, never get too worked up about things. That was not me, you know. It just wasn't. I wish I was more like that, but I wasn't born like that. I was born with a different sort of temperament. And so, after my son was born, I sort of found myself modeling kind of reactions for him that I didn't want him to struggle with, things that I'd struggle with that I didn't want him to struggle with. And being a good father was very important to me. So I was like, okay, I've got to do something about this, you know. And it just so happened that about that time, I came across a book about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Right? And I started reading this book and I was like, that's the kind of guy I would like to be. That's the kind of, you know, guy I'd like my son to grow to become. You know? And so I had never been a particularly religious person. Probably fair to say I'm still not a particularly religious person because I don't actually see Buddhism as a religion really in the Western sense, like this set of beliefs that you have to adopt. That's kind of how I understood religion. And so I'd never really fallen in for that. But it seemed pretty clear to me reading about His Holiness and then reading a couple other books that these methods work. Something about these practices work to produce people who deal with things in a certain kind of way, you know, in terms of compassion and kindness and steadfastness and all these sorts of characteristics I would have liked to have had in myself. So I sort of dove into Buddhism really deeply for probably about 3 years. So meditating a couple hours a day, you know, an hour in the morning and hour in the evening, and mixed in with that was working on anundro, preliminary practices, so prostrations, various different practices that you would do, going to teachings. I went to see different teachers, went to see His Holiness a few times. Luckily in this region, it's kind of strange, as small as Spokane and the area is, there are actually quite a lot of resources for people who want to delve into Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism. Kind of oddly enough, in rural Washington, we have these tremendous resources. It's really wonderful. And so anyway, at the end of 3 years, I was aware that although I still struggle with some of the stuff that I struggled with before and probably always will, because that's kind of my temperament, things were very, very, very different. And I looked a whole lot more like the sort of person I wanted to be, you know, sort of parent I wanted to be, you know, those sorts of things. And I attributed that to my Buddhist practice, and particularly to the practices I had learned to do involving compassion. So the compassion practices were really the things that were transformative for me. And at some point, I sort of got to the point where I thought, I can't, like just personally, I can't imagine continuing to function as a psychologist without bringing this stuff that I'm learning, this compassion stuff I'm learning in Buddhism, into the therapy room, because this is as powerful as anything else I've ever encountered in all the training I'd ever had in psychology. So, I'm enough of a scientist, though. I'm not a terribly good scientist. I see the big picture. I see patterns really quickly, really easily. but I can get overwhelmed by too many details, and major research studies have lots of little details. And so I'm a very good research collaborator. I'm not a very good, kind of big researcher just to do it myself. But I'm enough of a researcher to be actually uncomfortable with saying, okay, I'm just going to reach into this spiritual tradition and pluck out the techniques that I like and use them in the therapy room. That didn't feel right to me. It felt not okay from a scientific perspective, and it felt disrespectful to this religion that I benefited so much from. It felt disrespectful to Buddhism. Okay, I'm just going to lift your techniques here. But it occurred to me that I can't be the only person in psychology who's ever had this revelation about capacity, right? I can't be the only person that this has occurred to. And so I read a good bit more, and I came across this guy in the UK named Paul Gilbert. Now, Paul is a psychologist who was a professor at the University of Derby in England for many years. And he had developed this model of therapy called compassion-focused therapy. And I went over and went to a 3-day training of his, and he put me up at his house. So we trained all day and then spent all night kind of talking about CFT. And at the end of these 3 days, I'm like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. This is my thing. Then there's that moment. It can be pretty powerful, when you hit this moment where you're like, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. This is what my life is going to be about. And there's that moment where that clicked for me. And it felt really good. And what's interesting is that made it a lot easier for me to be fearless from that point on in kind of going after and doing the things that were important to me, because it's like I knew this is what I'm going to do. Does that make sense? And so there's something about that conviction, about like figuring out who you are and what you're about and what you want your life to be about, and like doing that. And when that happened for me, it was really an epiphany, because you should know I'm like a profoundly lazy human being. I really am. And people say, no, Russell, you're not. You're really not. No, I am. I really am. If I like think of something as work, it's really easy for me to be like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do, But the really wonderful thing about compassion and CFT is all this, is it's like, it doesn't feel like work. And I think that's what happens when you find your thing. There's this effortless part where you're doing it because that's what you're doing, and it's fun and it's rewarding and it's engaging for you. And you can do it well because you're passionate about it. So you think about it even when you don't have to, and those sorts of things. And that's how CFT has been for me, and compassion and things like this. And so it's turned into this whole world of opportunity for me. So it's odd, because I find myself doing things like going around the world and doing workshops, teaching people to do this work, and writing these books and things like that. And that's all just so far beyond anything I thought would ever happen for me. I mean, the biggest dream I ever had in my life was to write a book, like a book. And I thought, well, and so I'm learning this CFT stuff, and then I'm talking with Paul Gilbert, the person who developed it, and he said, we've got this book series, and you're applying CFT to anger. Would you like to write a book in the series for this? And I thought, oh my gosh, would I like to write a book? This is like, And it was also terrifying to me, because I thought, this is not something I can do. Those people who write books, they're like, they're those special people, they're different to me. They've got that thing, and I can't do that. I can just sit back and dream of being that special. But and it turns out that actually writing books is and is not that difficult. It requires a lot of thought and a lot of time spent thinking about what you're going to write and be familiar with that. And pretty much from that point on, you've just got to set your butt down and write. And if you do that enough times, eventually there's a book there. And of course, it helps if you've got someone who wants to publish it, and that was very useful to have that kind of opportunity. But it was really kind of fun, because when that happened for me, and the anger book came out, which is the Compassionate Mind Guide to Managing Your Anger, that was it. I found myself in this really weird place of having a wonderful job at EWU, and they treat us so well there. Being faculty at Eastern Washington University is a wonderful, wonderful career. It really is a wonderful place. So I had this job that I loved, and I'd just written this book. And I can go into the bookstores, and there it is. And that was it. Professionally speaking, at this point, all my dreams had come true. This was... It was. So pretty much everything from that point is just gravy. Then it was fun, because I've been able to just kind of play and think, okay, what's important to me? You know, what do I want to do? What do I want to put out into the world? If I drop dead at any random point, which inevitably I will, what can I do between now and that moment that as I'm dying I can go, you know, I did all right. You know, I did what I meant to do, or what I wanted to do. And so it's been really fun. And it turns out, at least in my case, the more I have worked at kind of putting compassion out there into the world and helping people understand what that is and apply it to their own lives, these opportunities just arise all over the place. You know, and of course that creates a whole other set of problems, you know. Not big problems, they're the problems you like to have, but you know, you think it's tough saying no to the stuff you don't want to do, and that is tough. It's even harder saying no to the stuff you really do want to do, but you just don't have time or energy or resources to. So now that's kind of where I find myself at. It's like you getting to pick and choose from these opportunities. And that feels crazy to me. That feels crazy to me, you know, to get an email from someone halfway across the globe and say, hey, we'd like you to come and do this. I'm like, really? Are you sure? Are you sure? You sure you don't want her? You know? But that, you know, I think maybe that, you know, after what, a 20-minute introduction, it's ridiculous, right? That's kind of a good segue into what I'd like to talk about. Because, you know, that voice in your head that says, are you sure? Are you sure you don't want someone else? Or that voice that you hear talking to you that says, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. Look at what's wrong with me. You know, I think that's kind of the voice that holds a lot of us back. That kind of judgmental, critical voice that either it's the voice that like doubt. And doubt is a good thing, by the way. We need to be aware. This is one of the things I don't do, by the way, and I'm not going to do. You know, I'm not someone that goes out and says, you can be anything you want. You know? Because that's not true. It's just not true. If you could be anything you want, if you could be anything you want, I'll be honest with you, my life wouldn't have turned out nearly as well if you could be anything you want, because I wouldn't be sitting here in this amazing Buddhist monastery looking out this window at this gorgeous day talking with wonderful people. I'd be a rock and roll guitar player. And I'd have a miserable life, because touring is not for me, but I would try to do it because I love music, you know. But it turns out that I'm actually a pretty crappy guitar player. I've been a crappy guitar player for well over 30 years. Whatever that thing is, I don't have it, you know. So, and I can kind of muddle my way through things. But when you see really good players, there are kids at Mount Spokane High School right now who have been playing for 2 years who are better guitar players than me. You know, so I can't do that. So I can't tell you, you can do anything you want, right? Because we all have these sort of inherent capacities, these things. We have things that we tend to be better at and things that we don't. But I think the key is like finding a way to play to your own strengths. And to do that in a way that's like really meaningful and which expresses your values. So it's finding that place that, what can I do Well, I'm a crappy guitar player, but for whatever reason, I can string to words together pretty well. Well, being a college professor is not a bad vocation for someone who can put words together pretty well, because you end up talking a lot and writing a lot, and that's something I can do. On the other hand, if you want me to build something for you, I'll just find someone who can, right? Because that's not my thing. So, because I'm a psychologist, and actually I think Venerable Damcho tipped me off a little bit that at least one of you had asked something about how do you work with afflictive emotions? How do you work with difficulties? So I'd like to transition from the self-doubt, self-critical voice, which I think will probably arise again, will probably come up again in the conversation, to move more directly to that question, right? How do we work with difficult emotions? And as I've mentioned, I talk a lot about compassion and do a lot of work in compassion-focused therapy. And when I'm doing general talks about compassion, maybe it's because I'm a psychologist, or maybe it's just because, I often find myself talking about obstacles to compassion, or barriers, things that get in the way. And I actually think the reason I do that is that I think, and I think there's some data to back this up, that in a vacuum, when we feel, we being human beings, and actually probably even other beings, in a vacuum, when we feel relatively safe, when we're relatively physically comfortable, when our needs are met, we tend to help one another. We tend to be pro-social. Kindness and compassion just kind of tend to happen. And there are there's lots of kind of anecdotal evidence. If you go on YouTube, and of course I'm never going to encourage anyone to spend more time on the computer than they absolutely need to, but if you go on YouTube, you can find just countless examples of little kids or even animals doing these sort of spontaneously caring, kind, compassionate things. They just do it. It doesn't even seem like they really need to be taught. They do those things. And so if we have that emotional state, and I think in large part it comes down to feeling safe. If I feel safe, if I'm feeling okay, my needs are met, what can happen is that our attention and our ability to think flexibly really opens up. It opens wide. And so we can take different perspectives, we can think about things from different points of view. We can do things like empathizing, right? Not just getting caught up in our own emotions, but paying attention to what other people are feeling, and caring about what other people are feeling, and thinking about what other people are feeling. Thinking, oh gosh, what's from her side, from his side, what does this feel like right now? And we could even do something, there's a British psychologist named Peter Fonagy who coined this term, I think he coined the term mentalizing. And what mentalizing is sort of understanding that other people's behaviors are reflective of underlying mental causes, and considering what those mental causes are. So thinking, okay, if someone, rather than just responding to the content of the behavior, thinking, how does it make sense that this person would behave this way in this situation? What could be going on in her or his mind? What needs do they have that they're trying to meet? What feelings are coming up for them? How are they making sense of this situation? Now, as you might imagine, if we can do that, it's actually a really effective way of working with our own emotions. Because a lot of times when we get really emotionally dysregulated, it's because kind of threat processing kicks in. And threat processing is really quick, right? If we've learned that something is dangerous, if something from our background has taught us that something is dangerous, something's a threat, our threat response, emotions like anger or fear or those sorts of things, disgust, can come about very quickly. So somebody does something and you may not even know what it was they did, but if it triggers this kind of implicit learning, our brains have stored, this goes with that. So they do something, it triggers that threat response, we can have those feelings arise in us, and what happens when we feel unsafe, what happens when those threat emotions come up, is sort of the opposite of what happens when we feel safe. Our attention comes in, becomes very narrow. Our thinking and reasoning becomes very narrow and inflexible. So we're no longer able, when those emotions, when that anger or fear leaps up in us, we're no longer able to be cognitively flexible, to look at things from different perspectives, to think about things in different ways. What tends to happen is we focus our attention right on the perceived threat, and that's what we think about too. And maybe you've had this experience in your life. You know, you're trucking along, doing whatever you're doing, and then something happens that triggers that threat response in you. And suddenly that's all you can think about. Right? And you just go over it in your head. Maybe playing the situation over in imagery like it's a movie. You might find yourself trying, maybe you've got a big project or a test you've got to study for or something like this, and so you try to think about something else, but your brain keeps going back to that perceived threat. Have you had this experience? Right? I hope it's not just me, right? No. No. And if you think about it, and this is the thing I like about the science part of compassion-focused therapy. If we think about this from an evolutionary perspective, that makes a whole lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, if you really ask the question, why would I have anger? Why would I have fear? Well, the answer to that is because something about those emotions and how they play out in us granted survival value to our ancestors. In fact, I'd like to do a little exercise, just really quickly. I'd like you to look around at one another. Just like look around at one another and really see one another. And when you see one another, I'd like you to do this with a little bit of awe. Because from a biological standpoint, everyone you see in this room represents, I'm not going to use the word miracle because it seems a little over the top, but represents like the pinnacle of evolution. And what I mean by that is that everyone you see represents a continuous stream of life going all the way back to the very first glimmering of life on this planet, the very first spark of life in whatever ocean or wherever it happened. Everyone you see walking and talking represents a flow of life that goes all the way back to that. If even one of your ancestors, even one across the thousands, millions of years that life has occurred on this planet, if even one of those ancestors had not survived to reproduce, you wouldn't be here. Think about that. I mean, I don't know about you. The first time I got, wow. There's something kind of special about that, right? I mean, the number of us that are here pales in comparison to the number of beings that never got to exist because their ancestors didn't make it, didn't reproduce, these different things that happen, right? So what this means, though, is that we are the daughters and sons of the ones that lived. And we carry with us the characteristics that allowed their survival. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it's important to recognize that evolution is not particularly concerned with your happiness. Now there's an asterisk. And the asterisk is, except insofar as your happiness contributes to your survival and reproduction. Does that make sense? There's a reason that sex feels good, right? Sex feels good because the ancestors that we had throughout the years for whom sex didn't feel good, didn't have sex, didn't reproduce, didn't pass their genes on, right? But on the whole, if we want to be happy and we want to create happy lives and happy societies, it's sort of up to us. It doesn't necessarily happen by default because, you know, our genetic propensities really are about survival. And not even our survival, but our ancestors' survival in many ways. Because what we see if we look at human society now, I mean, you know, let's be honest. You know, this is a kind of a young adults week here. The world that you live in now, you know, the point I'm trying to make is that social evolution in humans over the last 100 years, the last few hundred years, has moved so much more quickly than the process of biological evolution that a lot of the way our emotions work, I think you can make a case that these emotions are really better suited to an earlier time in the human story. That our culture, human culture, has transformed so quickly that we haven't caught up yet in terms of biological evolution. And the evidence of this, for me, has to do with what happens in my body and in my brain when I feel threatened, when I feel angry, when I feel afraid, things like this. Because really, think about it, when something triggers a fear response or a threat response in you, what's happening in your body? What's happening in your mind? Yeah, your heart starts racing.
Anxious.
You become anxious.
Tense.
You're tense. Narrowly focused on whatever the threat is, right? You're being prepared to fight or to flee or to freeze. Those are really the three responses that our threat response prepares us to do. Now, if you're having a conflict with your partner or your friend or your coworker, or you've just been, you know, someone's said something to you that wasn't so nice at an office meeting, or something like this had happened. Your professor is really rude to you in class and embarrasses you. Is fighting or fleeing or freezing the best response in that situation? In that social situation? No. No, not really. Right? Not really. But that's exactly what our bodies are preparing us to do. So there's this sort of conflict between what we're feeling and the demands of the social situation. Because the current demands of the social situation are such that for most of us, now this is not true. There are actually plenty of people in the world that face very real physical threats. Fight, flight, freeze threats. But in the West, you know, in the kind of world we live in, those sorts of threats, at least in my life, are pretty rare, right? Much more common are the kind of nuanced social threats in which, instead of being prepared to fight or flight or freeze and having my heart rate go up and get tense and focus my attention here, it would usually be much more adaptive if I could think more flexibly, consider other people's perspectives, take a moment and become more aware, maybe have a conversation, those sorts of things. But that's not at all what our threat systems are preparing us to do. You know, your threat systems are preparing you to respond to the tiger, right? You know, it makes sense. I mean, if you look at it this way, if we take this approach to kind of understanding how we are, I think it can be pretty useful in understanding some of the tricky bits that people encounter. How many of you, for example, have ever gotten sick on something? Maybe you had the flu or something and you got sick on it, and then you couldn't eat it in the future. You smelled it and this wave of disgust washed over you, right? That's called conditioned taste aversion. And you know, there's certain forms of human learning, particularly threat-based learning, that occur really quickly, like in a single trial. So you think about it. Once this happened to me, I decided to make some pad thai noodles many years ago, and we decided to make shrimp pad thai, and we were at the grocery store, and I bought a little package of shrimp. I thought it had probably been there a couple days already, and I took it home. And unfortunately, I waited another 2 or 3 days before I made the pad thai. And then I made it, and you can imagine what happened, right? We had bad shrimp and got very sick. I love pad thai. The next time we were at our favorite Thai restaurant, and I went to order pad thai. I was like, oh, can't do it. Right now, luckily being a psychologist, I knew how to desensitize myself to that over time, and I found my way back to pad thai noodles eventually, which I'm very thankful for. But we can imagine how and why this kind of threat learning, this disgust response evolved. I mean, I want you to imagine, you're kind of primordial human walking through the countryside, and I don't know if you've been to Manitou Park in Spokane, but I'm sure you've got them around here too. You come across a bush with these really tasty looking berries, these beautiful red berries, and they look great, but they're not edible, right? Now, you don't know this. You've never encountered these berries before. You've had raspberries, they're delicious. You've had strawberries, they're wonderful. These look equally beautiful, but might they be tasty, right? So you gather up a big bunch of them, you sit down, you have them for lunch. The problem is they're not edible. You almost die. You become very sick, right? What do you think? Do you think it's adaptive? The next time you walk by that bush, you see those berries, you go, ugh, I don't want those, right? And someone else goes for it, and you're like, no, trust me on that, right? No. Right? There's some adaptiveness to that, right? And so we can see where these sort of tendencies come from. We have pretty big problems with obesity in the West these days. The last 10 or 15 years, rates of obesity have skyrocketed. And there are lots of reasons for this, I suspect. But let me ask you a question. Have any of you ever wished that you could crave broccoli the way you crave pizza? Wouldn't that be great? Couldn't I crave this healthy stuff the way I crave this high fat, high salt, high sugar stuff, the chocolate or the ice cream or whatever your thing is. For me, I'm a salty snack guy, so for me it's like the pizza or the popcorn and stuff like this. You may also notice that when you have those foods, those kind of high salt, high fat, high sugar foods, that there's something even comforting about them. You eat them and you're like, we even have this word, comfort food, to describe it. No one uses the word comfort food to describe a nice plate of Brussels sprouts or some raw carrots or something really healthy, right? It's always this really, so I've actually thought about that. Gosh, I wish I could just crave the healthy stuff. Well, why don't we? Well, because we didn't evolve to deal with plenty. We evolved to deal with scarcity. And when you live in a world of scarcity in which you don't know when your next meal, you don't know if next week you're going to have food, right? Then there are certain foods that grant survival value. So for example, high-fat foods allow you to pack on some stores to make through the lean times. High-sugar foods grant energy. And salt is a mineral that's actually crucial for human survival and which occurs fairly rarely in the natural world. If you're foraging, you're not going to get a whole lot of salt. So does it make sense that for our ancestors, when they encountered foods that were high fat, high sugar, or salty, that they would want to consume quite a lot of those, and that would be something that would cause them to feel soothed, right? Because of the survival value that those foods carried with them, right? Fat, sugar, salt, very helpful when you live in scarcity. However, we now live in a world where we're surrounded by really cheap, high-fat, high-salt, sugary foods. It turns out that those sort of ingredients can be produced very cheaply and very abundantly. And so now we have this sort of odd reality in which you can go to a grocery store and buy completely sugar-filled fruit snacks at 1/3 of the price of actual fruit. Right? And so I think that people that produce food actually, and in the United States, this is, I think, a particular problem, because in the US we're very good at making money, we're very good at producing profit. And so one of the things you see is that if you buy the same product in the States versus in different places in Europe, sometimes you'll have almost twice the salt in the US, you know. And that's for a reason. It's because, you know, salt, a food with a lot of salt in it, tastes good when you're tossing it down really quickly, right? It capitalizes on those cravings. So anyway, that's just a couple things to help recognize that we carry with us a lot of propensities that we didn't necessarily get to choose or to design, but that we have to learn to work with if we're going to have happy lives and we're going to have good relationships and we're going to be able to make our lives about something meaningful. Because, you know, it's easy. We live in a culture, I think, where there are lots of threat triggers out there. There are lots of things that can trigger that threat response and kick us into anger or fear or things like this. And if we're not careful, I think it's easy to create a lifestyle where your life becomes about trying to maintain a certain level of comfortableness, right? Trying to just not feel that stuff because it's uncomfortable. We don't like to feel angry. We don't like to feel anxious. We don't like to feel these sorts of things. And so we can end up building these lives really of avoidance, where we just work to not think about that stuff. And so, for example, my work has a lot to do with applying compassion-focused therapy in the treatment of problematic anger. And, you know, one of the things about anger that's sort of interesting is that we already have a fair number of pretty effective anger management techniques. That stuff's out there. I mean, the world did not need me to write a book to present anger management techniques. Lots of other really wonderful people have already done that work. They're out there. The tricky bit is getting people to use them. Because before you can use them, you've got to kind of come face to face with the realization that I've got an anger problem. And that's the hard part. You know what I'm saying? Because it's like a painful thing. Have you ever had this experience where you're in an interaction and it's not going well? Or there's a situation, there's a problem, and then there's this like fleeting awareness that the problem in this situation is you and how you're reacting or how you're taking it or how you're interpreting it. Does that make sense? You know? And when that happens, it's not comfortable. It's not comfortable. It doesn't feel good. So I think very often in response to that discomfort, it's very easy to avoid. And we avoid, you know, and this is just talking about anger. I mean, we avoid in all sorts of different ways. You know, we can avoid by just like focusing our attention on something else. You know, and the nice thing is that in this culture, we have countless distractions. Things that if we want to shift our attention really quickly, countless things saying, oh, come over here, right? Those little handheld computers we hold, you know, our little cell phones, right? That, you know, contain all of the knowledge accumulated throughout human history. And they do, right? You've got the entirety of human knowledge, like, in your pocket. And what do we use it for? You know. Yeah, to share pictures of cats. Or to let people know what we had for dinner, you know. So it's really, we distract ourselves. We rationalize. We explain it away. Well, you know, I have the right to be angry about this, right? Because of this and this and this and this. Yeah. Or other ways we avoid, here's a good one. We blame the other person for our own reaction. I only said that because you did that. Right? You ever find yourself doing that? Right. So but the problem is these are all like methods of avoidance. These are all like things we do to keep from facing the reality that how I'm behaving is it doesn't fit with the sort of person I want to be. And that's a really painful, it can be a really painful realization to come to. And so I guess if there's a question, I think, Venerable Damche, when you sent me the email and said, someone had asked something about how do you work with afflictive emotions from a psychological standpoint, that's actually a really big question. It's a really big question because the answer is, well, that depends, and at the level of what sort of techniques or what specific things you do. It depends if you're talking about anxiety or anger or depression or whatever it is you're talking about. But I think one kind of broad thing that we have to be able to do if we're going to help ourselves work with those difficulties is to learn to apply compassion to ourselves and to rather than getting caught up in the shame that can arise when we observe that there's a big gap between the person I'm sort of my current behavior and the person I want to be, and then using that pain as a trigger to distract and avoid, right? And I think a lot of us are stuck in that loop. We have this idea that, I'd like to do better, I'd like to get better, I'd like to be better, I'd like to da-da-da-da-da. And then we observe ourselves behaving in a way that doesn't fit at all like that, and then it's so painful that we forget about it and we go online. Or we turn on the television, or we think about something else, or we just go to work. We stop dreaming the big dreams because we see how far we are from that. And it's distressing to us, so we just go back to the daily grind. That kind of avoidance. And I think the way through that, I think the secret, there was my first Buddhist experience in terms of ongoing daily or weekly Buddhist practice was actually through a Nyingma center in Spokane called Pe Maling. And it was interesting, the teacher there was actually a German woman named Lama Inga, and she was just wonderful. And her teacher had been someone named Chagdud Tulku Rinpoche, who came over actually to Oregon and had taught there for several years. Now, it's interesting because Chagdud Rinpoche passed away actually fairly shortly before, just a year or two, I think, before I began Buddhist practice. So I didn't get to learn from him. And I read one of his books, but actually one of the most profound teachings I ever got from any Buddhist teacher was through a t-shirt on Chagdud Rinpoche's website. And I think it had a picture of him, or maybe it didn't, but apparently he said this a lot. I don't know, because I never met the man, I never learned from him. But the slogan was, keep going. And to me, that teaching has had as much or more impact on my life than almost any other. Keep going in the face of whatever the fear is, in face of the discomfort that comes up when you realize I'm not how I'd like to be. Keep going when the thoughts of I can't do this come up. And I think what allows us to keep going is learning to apply compassion to ourselves. So the idea being that when we have those moments that we have this fleeting awareness that the way I'm dealing with things, or the way I'm behaving, or the way whatever I'm doing doesn't fit with how I want to be. And that pain comes up, or the shame, or whatever it is, the I can't do it, and that tendency to pull away and avoid and distract ourselves comes up. What if instead of giving in to that and saying, okay, I'll turn the channel because this one's disturbing to me, what if we said, oh, well, yeah, this is uncomfortable. Of course this is uncomfortable. I mean, wouldn't it be uncomfortable? Wouldn't it be uncomfortable to face these things about yourself that you don't like? Of course it is. But how are you going to get better? What if, in that moment, we could relate to ourselves the way we would relate to someone that we dearly loved, to someone that we only wanted to benefit, right? Maybe to a child that we wanted to see really succeed in a difficult task. What would you say? Would you say to that child, no, you can't do it, you should just give up? No. What would you say? Keep going, yeah. That was kind of a setup, wasn't it? You might validate them. You might say, this is really hard. What you're trying to do is really hard. I get it, but you can do it. Just keep going. Just keep trying. Unless it was me and I wanted to be a rock and roll guitar player, you might say, well, Russell, that's a nice dream. Maybe be a little more honest with yourself. But the idea is that we can bring kindness to that struggle. When we see that stuff coming up in us, these emotions that play up really powerfully in us, but emotions that, let's face it, we didn't get to choose them, we didn't design them. Right? Did you get to choose or design how your anger or how your fear play out in you? When those emotions come up in you, do they come up because you wake up in the morning and you think, I think today I will be resentful. Just to mix it up a bit. No. It comes up in us. And what if at that moment you could say, instead of just rolling with it and being resentful all day, or going, look at me, I'm so ungrateful, what a terrible person I am, and beating yourself up for it. What if you could say, wow, I'm feeling really resentful and jealous because this person that I work with got this opportunity that I was really hoping for, or they got this recognition that I would really like to have, and that hurts. What if we could say, well, yeah, this hurts, this is really uncomfortable. What would be helpful? What would help me feel safe? What would help me keep going to try and live in a way that fits with the sort of person I want to be? So I think that we can have this idea that the way to keep ourselves going is to criticize ourselves and to crack the whip and things like this. And I actually don't think that's true at all. I think the problem with doing that is it keeps us in that threat place. Keeps our attention narrow, keeps our thinking focused. If we want to be at our best, we have to help ourselves learn to feel safe, because when we do that, it all opens up. And we can be reflective, we can see things from different perspectives, and we can, at that point, ask the big questions. Like, what kind of person do I want to be? What do I want to leave? What do I want to give to the world? What do I want to put out there? Those sorts of things. So I guess my answer to this question, how do you work with afflictive emotions? I think it starts with compassion and with kindness and this willingness to be vulnerable, to feel, to recognize that, gosh, I have all these feelings and they come up in me and they're really difficult and they're really painful. And then to allow ourselves even maybe to be moved by that. Like, oh, this is really hard. And then to ask, what would help? And that's kind of the definition of compassion. If you look up a dictionary definition, or you listen to the Dalai Lama talk about compassion, or you read my book or Paul Gilbert's book, you'll hear these two components. Sensitivity to suffering, allowing ourselves to notice it and be moved by it, and then motivation to help. So those are the two components, sensitivity and motivation. Right? But at a real experiential level, it's kind of like, oh, that hurts. What would help? Right? Just to recognize, to accept, this is the way it is. This is painful. Look, there's suffering. Now, and then to ask, what would be helpful? Now, I talk to a lot of people with compassion, and often when I'm talking with people about compassion, it's not audiences quite as receptive as you, right? Sometimes it's people who are really angry, sometimes who live in prisons, you know, or people that their whole lives, they use anger maybe as a way to feel powerful in their lives, so they can be very skeptical. And they can, a lot of people actually just walking around every day have this idea that compassion is sort of pink and fluffy and sweet, and it means being like soft and just nice and gullible and all that stuff. And, you know, I want to say, to me, compassion is the opposite of that. It's the opposite of the avoidance we talked about earlier. Compassion is about turning toward suffering, turning towards it and allowing ourselves to be moved by it. And it also means not just like fleetingly turning toward the suffering, going, oh yes, I've turned toward the suffering, good for me, and let me go surf the internet again. But actually looking deeply into the suffering, looking deeply into the causes and conditions that produce and maintain it. Because if we're going to actualize the second part of compassion, if we're actually going to be able to help with whatever this suffering is, we've got to understand it. We've got to understand why and how it comes about, right? What's the problem here? Because only then do we have a chance to actually help, right? So we've got to find ways to soothe ourselves and help ourselves feel safe as we come into contact with whatever the suffering is, so we can learn enough about the causes and conditions that contribute to it to actually perform some sort of skillful action. And I think this is very important. I think compassion, at some level, you know, we're going to want to manifest it, right? It's something we cultivate in our minds, but it's also something, you know, we kind of put out into the world. But in order to do that well, we have to understand the suffering. We have to understand what's going on there, because if we don't, it's almost impossible to be skillful, right? If I don't get, so for example, in therapy, one of the things you want to do with clients is to establish a good working therapeutic relationship. Now, I've talked with you about how when are we finishing up?
We'll take a break at 10.
At 10, okay, good. That's perfect in terms of timing. I just wanted to make sure. So I've talked about how if we're going to be at our best and work with difficult problems, we have to start by helping ourselves feel safe, right? To open up the attention and do that sort of thing. Well, the way human beings primarily feel safe, and this is probably related to kind of biological evolution, is through affiliative connections with others, right? In fact, and when I say safe, I don't mean an absence of threat, right? You know, the guy sitting on the porch with the arsenal of guns, sitting here like this, making sure no one's going to get close. Does he feel safe? No. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Safe, feeling safe is like feeling peaceful, calm, relaxed. Think about the last time. Hopefully it's been this week, but think about a time recently in your life. I know I feel this way at the Abbey, where you're like, this is all right. You're not chasing after any goals. You know, no threats you have to fight off. You can just be here in the present, doing what you're doing, and you feel okay, you feel safe, right? For humans, that usually happens in the context of relationships with others. Now, that's not the only thing that can facilitate it, but very often there's that affiliative component. We know that we're with people who care about us, who value us, who like us, who aren't going to attack us, you know. That's, for most of us, that's how we feel safe, is through those relationships, those connections with others. Now, this can be very tricky for people who have like an abusive background, or who have a traumatic history that involved other people and things like this. Because again, I mentioned our brains can be very efficient in learning in the context of threat. Our brains are very good, and this happens, we don't get to choose. This is implicit, it's non-conscious. When something bad happens to us, and we're hurt, our brains are very good at taking whatever features, whatever's in the environment, and linking that with danger. Right? So if people come from particular histories of relationships that were harmful or abusive or scary, that can be a very tricky situation, because what can happen is that instead of associating closeness with safeness, which is kind of how it's supposed to work, they can associate closeness with threat. And maybe you've had this experience, or maybe you know someone who has, people who find themselves in relationships, and as the relationship starts to get closer and you think they should be feeling safer, they actually start to panic instead. They get more uncomfortable. And this can be terrifying for people. It can feel maddening, because you can both want closeness, want to have a good relationship, want to be connected, and have this implicit panic that comes up as soon as you get there. Right? And if you've ever been in a relationship with someone who's like that, that can be very tricky too, because it seems like everything's going all right, and just as the relationship starts getting a little closer, they freak out. And you have no understanding of why. Or you freak out and you have no understanding of why. And if that happens to you or to them, it's not any of your fault. It's because something has happened in your background that has caused your brain to connect closeness and danger. And if you're in a situation where the people that are supposed to take care of you actually hurt you, it makes sense that you would learn that. But for therapists, that creates kind of a tricky situation, and one in which we have to be patient and kind of confident in the way we approach things. Because imagine that client comes in, that this client has this background that has taught them that closeness means being unsafe. And I, in my mind, know that, most people feel safe through connection with others. So my goal in the therapy, and this is always a goal in the therapy, is to build a collaborative working relationship with that person. There's a certain degree of relational closeness that is part of what happens in therapy. But what happens if in the first session I go gung-ho on that and really try to, I'm here for you, right? And to really kind of push that relational aspect of the therapy. Is that going to help the other person feel safe? No. No, in fact, they probably won't even come back, because I will have unknowingly set off their threat triggers. Right? Instead, what I can do, instead of trying to force a close relationship, I can, if I think about this, if my compassion is wise and I take some time to learn about their history of relationships and their background, and to form some hypotheses about how they feel safe and if they do or don't in relationship to other people, I can allow that relationship to form gradually, and maybe even help them to learn, to notice that I actually feel safe, feel threatened when things get close. So if that plays out in the therapeutic relationship, can point that out. How are you feeling now? Right? We see this sometimes. This happens for therapists. If I was talking to a group of therapists and I said this, everyone in the room would be nodding. You're working with a client. It seems like they're gradually feeling safer. They've been holding back. They haven't been saying much. And then eventually, one day they feel safe enough and they just dump and they tell you their whole story. And as the therapist, you're walking out of the room going, yeah, that's therapy now. Right? I got the whole story. And what happens next week? They don't come. They don't come, because on the drive home, they're completely overwhelmed by the fact that they just, they allowed themselves to feel safe for a moment, and then it all spilled up, and then, oh my gosh, what is it? This, the thoughts start going, what does this mean? Da, 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 da. And then there's just that implicit, that fear that comes, the conditioned fear that comes with the closeness. So, one of the things I try to do in therapy is to kind of forecast that. If I have the idea that that's something that can come, so during that session, the last 10 minutes of that session, when my client is it's all finally come out, I'm going to say, okay, let me tell you what's going to happen. What's going to happen is you're going to be driving home today, and you're going to go, oh my gosh, what just happened? And this level of closeness that has just happened between us with you sharing this, What do you think? Do you think that could feel threatening? And how are we going to work with that? You know? And when you wonder if you should come back next week, is there anything we could do? You know, are you wondering, you know, so for example, I might let the person know if sometime over the next week you're wondering about what I'm thinking after you telling me all this, why don't you give me a call and ask? You know, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking, or something like this. But the whole point of this long drawn out example, you see I'm a college professor. I never say anything in one sentence when I can say it in 20 minutes. The whole point of this is that compassion has to involve patience and wisdom. We can't just, you know, oh, there's suffering and here's what I'm going to do. Right? We've got to look deeply and to come to understand the difficulty. And maybe it's you know, for me a lot of times it's a challenge that one of my clients is presenting with. But for a lot of us, me included, it's a problem we're having. And instead of just doing this or doing that, if we can pause and kind of look deeply into it and go, okay, what's happening for me? You know, when in these situations, I feel these real powerful emotions. What situation is triggering that in me? What need am I having here that is being threatened or not being met? You know, what would help me feel safe if I was going to stay in this situation and keep going? Those sorts of things. So we've got like 7-8 minutes. Do you have any questions or things that have come up? Yeah.
Sometimes I have the experience where I know I'm feeling some sort of an afflictive emotion, but I can't identify it. So it's just this subtle sort of, you just feel like, ugh.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think about that?
I don't know, that's why I'm asking.
That's such a psychologist thing to say, isn't it? What do you think about that? How does it feel when that happens, when you kind of notice that and you notice also that you can't easily put a label to it?
It's just this vague negativity.
Yeah.
You know? And I think in a way it distances me from other people. And I want to sort of just close down. You know,
Yeah.
it's a kind of narrowing maybe.
Yeah. So it sort of feels like you're asking, well, what do I do? And so
Yeah, from your perspective.
Yeah, from my perspective. So, you know, what I might encourage you to do in that situation is to not worry so much about labeling it. Now, if you generally have a hard time labeling your emotions, and you're never really able to say, I'm angry, or I'm anxious, or I'm sad, then that's probably worth spending some time with. And there are people, yeah, but that was my sense. But in that situation you just described, I guess, you know, what I might suggest is that in that situation you worry less about categorizing your experience than about really paying attention to what it's like in that moment. So I'd encourage you, rather than thinking about, well, what is this? Is it this or this or this? To just kind of let that labeling, the desire to label, and I get that desire because that's how we make sense of our experience. But what if you let that kind of fall aside and just said, wow, I'm just really feeling blah right now, or I'm really, you know, I'm feeling, and maybe to notice how it's playing out in your body, and to notice what motivations come up with that. I'm noticing I'm wanting to pull back, I'm wanting to kind of shut in on myself. And then to kind of imagine, okay, what would be helpful here, right? In terms of what I know about me, and all the possible things I could do when I'm feeling like this. What will tend to get me closer? What sort of behaviors would tend to get me closer to what I want to do? And depending on what you know about yourself, that might be, you know, I'm going to go and do some journaling and just kind of write about what I'm feeling, and maybe that helps me kind of figure things out. For a lot of people, I think in that situation, one of the most helpful things to do is the counterintuitive thing, which is to actually reach out to someone and just say, hey, you know, I'm feeling kind of blah today. Could we go for a walk and just hang out or something like that? A lot of times I think when we're feeling that sort of thing, the tendency is to pull in and kind of isolate And for a lot of us, that will propagate that. And while it's the last thing we may feel like doing, one of the things that can really help is to actually reach out and to connect with people, or to activate in some other sort of way. So maybe go for a run, or go for a walk, or do something that'll invigorate. But that's a tough thing to do in that situation when you're feeling this kind of pull to come back. But what I wouldn't do is spend a lot of time beating yourself up because you're not having an easy time categorizing your experience, you know. And if I did have a convenient label for it, I don't know that it would be helpful for me to give that to you, because I'm much more interested in having you look at your experience and what it's really like than to have a convenient, let's put it in a box. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
yeah, it is.
I can say that feels familiar to me as you talk about it. It's like, oh yeah, I know that place. I get that.
It's not particularly bad.
No.
It's not good.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of,
Well, and what do you think? Is that okay to sometimes feel not particularly bad and not particularly good? Yeah.
it's just not comfortable.
Okay, so if it's not comfortable, yeah. So, and maybe if you're sitting there and it's feeling not comfortable, you might think about, okay, what happened kind of the last day or two? Is there something I can understand about me that, and what might have triggered this, and then move to what would be helpful. But it's also important to note that it's okay for us to be uncomfortable. We live in this culture that's kind of like, you should be happy all the time, and if you're not, there's something wrong with you. And that's just not true. It's just not in any way an accurate reflection of what it means to have a human life. And so I think the first thing that when that happens, rather than judging it and saying, oh, this is bad, you say, oh, wow, I've got this kind of uncomfortable, kind of downish feeling today. I don't know what that's about. Can I figure out what that's about? Well, it's not obviously coming to mind. What would be helpful? So that's kind of the thought I would have.